You've heard the endless lectures about American slavery. It's taught in schools, discussed in the media, referenced in politics, used to justify every progressive policy imaginable. We're told that America's original sin defines us forever, that we owe an eternal penance, that our entire nation is illegitimate because of the roughly 250 years of slavery that existed before abolition. But let me tell you about a slave trade that almost nobody talks about. A slave trade that lasted for 1,400 years. A slave trade that enslaved an estimated 17 to 20 million people from Africa alone, not counting the millions more from Europe, Asia, and other regions. A slave trade that was far more brutal, far more deadly, and far longer lasting than anything that happened in America. I'm talking about the Arab slave trade, the Islamic slave trade, the enslavement of human beings justified by religious text and carried out systematically across 3 continents for over a millennium. And you know why you've never heard much about it? It's because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because acknowledging it would complicate the simple story that the West is uniquely evil and that Islam is just a misunderstood religion of peace. Because the same people who want you to feel permanent guilt about American slavery don't want you to know that Islamic slavery was worse in every single measurable way and continued well into the 20th century. This episode is about the slave trade that they won't talk about, the historical reality they're desperate to hide, and more importantly, it's about why they're hiding it. Because understanding Islamic history reveals the agenda that's being pushed right now in America. The Red-Green Alliance we've discussed before, Marxist and Islamist working together to destroy Western civilization, that's not new. It's a continuation of Islam's 1,400-year project to conquer and subjugate the non-Muslim world. And American leftists, in their infinite stupidity, are helping them to do it. We're going to cover the historical facts about Arab slavery that you were never taught. We're going to expose why this history is suppressed, while American slavery is obsessed over. We're going to connect it to what's happening right now with Islamic immigration and influence in the West. And we're going to explain why leftists in a capitalist Christian nation are supporting the very ideologies that would destroy everything they claim to value. This is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Good. The truth should make you uncomfortable when you've been lied to your entire life.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
Let me start with facts, numbers, historical records, because this isn't opinion or an interpretation. This is documented history that's been deliberately hidden from you. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century with the rise of Islam and continued into the 20th century. That's over 1,300 years of systematic slavery. For context, American slavery lasted about 245 years, from the first slaves arriving in Virginia in 1619 to abolition in 1865. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates put the total number of Africans enslaved by Arabs at 17 million. Some historians estimate it was closer to 20 million or higher. This doesn't even include the millions of Europeans, Asians, and other peoples who were enslaved by Islamic empires over the centuries. Compare that to the Atlantic slave trade, which transported approximately 12.5 million Africans to the Americas, with only about 10.7 million surviving the journey. Of those, only about 388,000 came to what would become the United States. So, the Arab slave trade was larger, lasted longer, and affected more people than the Atlantic slave trade. But you wouldn't know that from American education or the media, would you? Now let's talk about the roots. The Arab slave trade operated through multiple channels simultaneously. The trans-Saharan route moved slaves from sub-Saharan Africa across the Sahara Desert to North Africa and the Middle East. This route alone is estimated to have trafficked 9 to 10 million people over the centuries. The journey was so brutal that mortality rates during transport were as high as 50%. Half of the people who started the journey died before reaching their destination. The Red Sea route transported slaves from East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Another 4 to 5 million people were moved through this route. The Indian Ocean route connected East Africa to the Middle East, Persia, and India. Millions more were enslaved through this network. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which was eventually abolished and condemned, the Arab slave trade continued openly well into the 1900s. Saudi Arabia didn't officially abolish slavery until 1962. Mauritania didn't abolish it until 1981. That's the year I was freaking born. And there's evidence. It still exists unofficially today. Now let's talk about what happened to these slaves, because this is where the Arab slave trade becomes even more horrific than the Atlantic slave trade. Male slaves were often castrated. This wasn't occasional, it was systematic. The Arabs created an entire class of eunuchs by castrating captured men and boys. The mortality rate from the castration procedure itself was between 60 and 90%. Most didn't survive the procedure. Why castrate them? To prevent them from reproducing. The goal wasn't just to exploit their labor. It was to use them completely and then eliminate any trace of their existence. Who does that? This is why there are no large populations of African-descended people in the Middle East today, despite centuries of massive slave importation. They were worked to death and prevented from having families. Women and girls were taken primarily for sexual slavery. Harems across the Islamic world were stocked with captured women. There were concubines forced into sexual servitude. Some became mothers of children who would be raised as Muslims, but the women themselves remained property. Children born to slave women often had a slightly better status than their mothers, but they were still subject to the slave system. And the constant demand for new slaves meant the trade never stopped. The conditions of slavery under Islamic rule were brutal. Slaves worked in mines, on agricultural estates, and as domestic servants, as soldiers, and in every capacity their owners required them to work. They had no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, beaten, killed with little to no consequence for the owner. Islamic law based on the Quran and Hadith explicitly permits slavery. Muhammad himself owned slaves, bought and sold slaves. And the Islamic legal tradition that developed over centuries codified slavery as permissible and even regulated its practice. This is not controversial Islamic history. This is documented in their own religious texts and legal traditions. Slavery is permitted in Islam. It was practiced from the beginning. And it continued for 1400 years because the religious justification remained intact. The Quran gives specific instructions about slaves, how to acquire them, how to treat them, under what conditions they can be freed, but it never condemns the institution itself. In fact, it assumes slavery is a normal part of society. Now compare this to Christianity. Yes, Christians participated in slavery, including the Atlantic slave trade. But Christianity contains the theological seeds of its own abolition. The idea that all humans are made in the image of God, that we're all equal before God, that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. These principles, taken seriously, make slavery untenable. That's why the abolition movement was led primarily by Christians. Quakers, Methodists, evangelicals. These were the people who fought to end slavery in the British Empire and in America. They used Christian theology to argue that slavery was incompatible with Christian truth. Islam has no such internal contradiction. Slavery is compatible with Islamic law. There's no theological imperative to abolish it. And that's why it's continued in Muslim societies long after it ended in Christian ones. The history is documented. It's not secret. The records exist in Arabic, in European accounts, in the archives as Islamic empires. Scholars who study this period know all of this. But it's not taught in American schools. It's not discussed in media coverage of slavery. It's not referenced in the endless guilt tripping about America's historical sins. Why? Because acknowledging the scope and brutality of Islamic slavery would undermine the narrative that Western civilization is uniquely evil. It would complicate the story that Christians and white people are responsible for all the world's suffering. It would force people to confront that slavery was a global institution practiced by many cultures, and that Islam practiced it longer and more brutally than anyone else. The people controlling education and media don't want you to know this. They want you to think slavery is an American sin, a Western sin, a white sin. They want you to carry the guilt that makes you susceptible to their political agenda. But the truth is that slavery was universal, And the Islamic version was worse in scope, duration, and brutality than what happened in America. And unlike America, which fought a civil war to end slavery, and then spent the next century and a half working toward racial equality, Islamic societies never went through that reckoning. Many still haven't fully acknowledged that what they did for 1400 years was wrong. That's the history they won't teach you. That's the truth they're desperate to hide. Now let's talk about why you've never learned this in school, why the media never discusses it, why the same people who want you to obsess over American slavery for 245 years are completely silent about Islamic slavery for 1400 years. It's not an accident. It's not an oversight. It's deliberate suppression designed to serve a political agenda. You see, the entire progressive narrative about Western civilization requires that the West be uniquely evil. Everything depends on it. The guilt, the reparations, the redistribution, the attacks on capitalism and Christianity, the promotion of socialism and multiculturalism. All of it relies on you believing that Western civilization is the source of all oppression. But if you acknowledge that Islamic civilization practiced slavery longer, on a larger scale, more brutally, and with explicit religious justification that has never been fully repudiated, that ruins the narrative. Suddenly, it's not about the West being uniquely evil. It's about slavery being a universal human practice that different civilizations participated in and ended at different times. Suddenly, you have to ask why the West abolished slavery while Islamic societies continued it into the 20th century. And that question leads to uncomfortable conclusions about the relative moral progress of different civilizations. The progressive left can't allow that conversation. Their entire worldview depends on moral relativism. All cultures are equally valid. There's no objective basis for saying one civilization is better than another, except when it comes to the West, which is uniquely terrible and must be condemned. But acknowledging Islamic slavery history breaks that framework. Because if you're going to condemn Western slavery, you have to condemn Islamic slavery. And if you condemn Islamic slavery, you're making a moral judgment about Islamic civilization and Islamic religious law. And that's Islamophobia. That's racism. That's religious intolerance. At least according to the progressive framework. So they suppress it. They don't teach it. They don't discuss it. They hope that you never learn about it, so you never ask the questions that would undermine their narrative. This is the same reason they suppress discussion of Islamic conquest more broadly. Islam didn't spread peacefully through persuasion. It spread through military conquest, forced conversion, and subjugation of conquered peoples. The Islamic empires were built on warfare, slavery, and the implementation of religious law over unwilling populations. This is a historical fact, but you're not supposed to talk about it because that's Islamophobic. You're supposed to pretend that Islam is just another religion, morally equivalent to Christianity, and that Muslims are just victims of Western aggression. The suppression serves another purpose, too. It protects the red-green alliance that we've discussed before. Progressive leftists and political Islam have made common cause against Western civilization. Marxists and Islamists are working together to undermine capitalism, Christianity, individual liberty, all the foundations of the West. But this alliance only works if people don't understand Islamic history and ideology. If Americans knew about the 1400 years of Islamic slavery, the systematic conquest, the implementation of Sharia law wherever Islam gains power, they might be less enthusiastic about importing Islamic ideology into America. They might start asking questions like, if Islam practiced slavery for 1400 years based on religious texts that never happened to be repudiated, what happens when Islamic populations gain political power in Western countries? Will they try to implement the same legal systems that justified slavery for centuries? These are legitimate questions, but asking them gets you labeled a bigot. So people don't ask. The history stays suppressed, and the alliance continues. Academic institutions are complicit in this suppression. Middle Eastern studies departments at major universities are often funded by Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. These countries donate millions to universities, and in exchange, they get influence over what's taught about Islam and Islamic history. Professors who want to teach honestly about Islamic slavery, Islamic conquest, the treatment of religious minorities under Islamic rule, they face career consequences. They lose funding. They get labeled as Islamophobic. They get pushed out of academia. Meanwhile, professors who present sanitized, romanticized versions of Islamic history get promoted. They get grants. They get published. The incentive structure ensures that the truth stays hidden. The media is just as complicit. Remember, 6 corporations control most of American media. And those corporations have business interests in the Middle East. They don't want to offend Gulf states that buy weapons, invest in American companies, and provide access to oil markets. So they don't cover Islamic slavery. They don't discuss the ongoing problems with slavery in parts of the Islamic world. They don't examine the theological basis for Islamic expansion and subjugation. Instead, they focus obsessively on Western sins, American slavery, European colonialism, white privilege. All the narratives that keep Western audiences focused on their own guilt while ignoring the equally severe or worse practices of other civilizations. This is information warfare. It's narrative control designed to shape how you see the world and how you see your own civilization. If you think the West is uniquely evil, you'll support policies that weaken the West. You'll accept mass immigration from Islamic countries because you think we owe them after our supposed colonial exploitation. You'll support restrictions on free speech because you think criticism of Islam is racism. You'll accept the erosion of Western values because you think those values are oppressive. But if you know the full history, if you know that Islamic slavery was worse than Western slavery, that Islamic conquest was more extensive than European colonialism, that Islamic law is fundamentally incompatible with individual liberty, you start asking different questions. You start wondering why we're importing a religious and political ideology that has caused oppression everywhere it's gained power. You start questioning the wisdom of allowing the implementation of Sharia law in Western countries. You start recognizing that not all cultures are equally compatible with freedom. And those questions lead to conclusions that the progressive left can't allow you to reach. So they suppress the history. They control the narrative. They make sure you never learn the truth about Islam's role in human slavery and oppression. But the truth is out there. The historical records exist. The scholars have documented all of this. You just have to be willing to look beyond the approved sources and the sanitized narratives. And once you see the truth, you understand why they were so desperate to hide it. Let's connect this historical understanding to what's happening in America right now. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing a pattern that's been consistent for 1400 years and that's playing out in the West today. Islam doesn't just spread through voluntary conversion. It spreads through migration, reproduction, political organization, and eventual demands for implementation of Islamic law. This is the pattern throughout history. And it's the pattern we're seeing in Western countries right now. The process is methodical. It starts with immigration. Muslims move into non-Muslim countries, initially in small numbers. They're welcomed because Western liberal values include tolerance for religious diversity. Then, the population grows through continued immigration and higher birth rates. This is not controversial. Muslim families in the West have significantly higher birth rates than non-Muslim families. It's demographic mathematics. As the population grows, Muslim communities begin to organize politically. They form advocacy groups. They establish mosques and Islamic centers. They build parallel institutions that serve their communities. Again, nothing inherently wrong with this. It's what immigrant communities do. But here's where it gets concerning. Alongside community building, there are systematic demands for accommodation of Islamic practices that conflict with Western norms. demands for halal food in schools and institutions, demand for prayer spaces, and time off for religious observance. Demands for gender-segregated facilities, demands for exemptions from curriculum that conflicts with Islamic teachings. Initially, these seem like reasonable requests for religious accommodation, but they're part of a pattern of establishing Islamic norms as requirements that non-Muslims must accommodate. Then come the demands for legal accommodation. Recognition of Islamic marriage practices that might include polygamy or child marriage. Attempts to implement Sharia law for personal status issues within Muslim communities. Pressure against criticism of Islam framed as hate speech that should be restricted. We're seeing all of this in Europe right now. Britain has Sharia councils operating parallel to the legal system. France has neighborhoods where French law is barely enforced and Islamic norms dominate. Sweden has Muslim majority areas that police describe as dangerous and difficult to patrol. This is what happens when you import large populations with a religious political ideology that is fundamentally incompatible with Western liberal values. The ideology doesn't adapt to the West. It demands that the West adapt to it. And Western liberals, in their infinite stupidity, accommodate every demand. Because they've been taught that all cultures are equal, that criticism of non-Western practices is racism, that Western values are oppressive. So they allow the establishment of parallel systems. They restrict free speech to avoid offending Muslims. They turn blind eye to practices that violate Western norms because enforcing those norms would be Islamophobic. The Muslim Brotherhood has explicitly stated their strategy for Western countries: build Muslim populations through immigration and birth rates, establish Islamic institutions, gain political influence, and eventually implement Islamic law. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's in their own strategic documents. And it's working. Because Western liberals are so paralyzed by guilt and so committed to multiculturalism that they can't recognize a religious political ideology is using their own values against them. Now let me be very clear about something. I'm not saying all Muslims are engaged in this strategy. Many Muslims who immigrate to the West want to assimilate. They want to embrace Western values, want to leave the oppressive practices of the country that they left behind them. But those Muslims are not the ones driving the agenda. The ones driving the agenda are the Islamic organizations funded by Gulf states, the advocacy groups pushing for Sharia accommodation, the political activists demanding that Western countries change their values to accommodate Islam. And here's where it connects to slavery. The same religious texts that justified 1,400 years of Islamic slavery are still considered holy and authoritative by the vast majority of Muslims. The Quran hasn't changed. The Hadith haven't changed. The legal tradition built on those texts hasn't fundamentally changed. Yes, most Muslims today don't practice slavery, but they also live in countries where secular law prevents it, not where Islamic law has repudiated it on theological grounds. In countries where Islamic law is implemented most strictly, Saudi Arabia, Iran, parts of Nigeria and Sudan, you see practices that would be unthinkable in the West. The treatment of women, treatment of religious minorities, treatment of homosexuals, implementation of corporal and capital punishment. All of this is justified by the same religious texts that justified slavery for over a millennium. So when we're told that importing large Muslim populations into Western countries is just about compassion for refugees or respect for religious diversity, we need to ask, what happens when these populations gain enough political power to start implementing their religious law? We're not talking about abstract theological differences. We're talking about a legal and social system that is fundamentally incompatible with individual liberty, equality before the law, free speech, religious freedom, women's rights, and every other principle that Western civilization is built on. Europe is the canary in the coal mine. They're 20 years ahead of America in Muslim migration, and they're seeing the results. Rising crime in Muslim-majority neighborhoods, sexual assault scandals involving gangs of Muslim men targeting non-Muslim girls, honor killings, female genital mutilation, terrorist attacks, demands for Sharia law. And European governments are paralyzed. They can't address these problems honestly because doing so would be Islamophobic. They can't enforce their own laws equally because that would be racist. They can't protect their own citizens because protecting people from practices justified by Islam would be religious intolerance. So the problems get worse. The parallel societies become more entrenched. The demands for accommodation become more extreme. And native Europeans start waking up to the fact that they've allowed the transformation of their countries through immigration policies that their leaders never asked permission to implement. America is following the same path. We're told we've got to accept these refugees from Muslim-majority countries. That we're told that criticism of Islam is bigotry. We're told that Islamic immigration is compatible with American values. But the evidence from Europe says otherwise. The historical pattern of Islamic expansion says otherwise. The current demands for Sharia accommodation in American communities say otherwise. This isn't about individual Muslims. This is about recognizing that Islam is not just a religion in the private sense that Christianity can be. Islam is a complete political, legal, and social system that claims authority over every aspect of life. And that system is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional republics based on individual liberty. When you combine this with the demographic trends, higher birth rates among Muslim families, continued immigration, political organization, you're looking at a timeline where Muslim populations in Western countries become large enough to seriously impact electoral politics and policy. And when that happens, when Muslims have enough political power to start implementing their priorities, what do you think those priorities are going to be? Accommodation of more Islamic practices, implementation of Sharia law for Muslim communities that gradually expands to affect non-Muslims, restrictions on speech that criticize Islam, changes to education to be more compatible with Islamic teaching. We're already seeing the early stages of this. School districts accommodating Islamic prayer and dietary requirements in ways they would never accommodate Christianity. Local governments allowing Sharia councils to operate. Politicians courting Muslim votes by supporting policies that undermine Western values. This is the Islamic agenda. It's not secret. It's not a conspiracy. Just the consistent pattern of Islamic expansion that's been playing out for 1,400 years. Migration, population growth, political organization, demands for accommodation, implementation of Islamic norms. And Western liberals are facilitating every stage of it because they're too damn stupid and too indoctrinated to recognize that not all ideologies are compatible with the liberal values they claim to support. Now let's talk about the unholy alliance that makes all of this possible. The collaboration between Marxist, leftists, and political Islam against Western civilization. This is called the Red-Green Alliance. I've talked about it before. Red for Marxism, green for Islam. Two ideologies that should be natural enemies, working together because they share a common target. The capitalist, Christian, liberal, democratic West. On paper, this alliance makes zero sense. Marxism is explicitly atheistic. It views religion as the opiate of the masses that must be eliminated. Islam is fundamentally theocratic. It demands submission to Allah and implementation of religious law. Marxists support women's equality, LGBT rights, sexual liberation. Islam enforces patriarchy, prescribes death for homosexuality, regulates sexual behavior through religious law. These ideologies are completely incompatible. In a pure Marxist society, Islam would be suppressed. In a pure Islamic society, Marxists would be executed. But they found common ground in their shared hatred of Western civilization. Both view the West as the primary obstacle to their goals. Both want to dismantle capitalism, Christianity, and individual liberty. Both are willing to work together to achieve that dismantling. even though they plan to turn on each other once the West falls. We have historical precedent for this. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 saw Marxists and Islamists collaborate to overthrow the Shah. The revolution succeeded. And then the Islamists systematically hunted down and executed their former Marxist allies. The useful idiots discovered they'd been used. But Western Marxists haven't learned this lesson. They're making the same mistake again, thinking they can use Islam as a weapon against Western civilization without becoming victims themselves. Let me explain how this alliance functions in practice. Marxists control academia, media, and major cultural institutions in the West. They use this control to promote narratives that delegitimize Western civilization and normalize Islam. They teach that Western colonialism and capitalism are the source of all problems in the Middle East, ignoring the role of Islamic conquest and the failures of Islamic governance. They present Islam as the victim of Western aggression, ignoring 1400 years of Islamic conquest and expansion. They frame any criticism of Islam as Islamophobia and racism, making it socially unacceptable to examine Islamic doctrine or practices honestly. They promote mass immigration from Muslim countries as a moral imperative, framing opposition as bigotry. All of this serves Marxist goals of undermining Western capitalism and Christianity. But it also serves Islamic goals of expanding Muslim populations and influence in the West. Meanwhile, Islamic organizations in the West adopt Marxist language and tactics. They present themselves as oppressed minorities fighting against systematic discrimination. They use the language of social justice and equity. They position their demands as anti-racist activism rather than religious imperialism. This is deliberate strategy. The Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic organizations have explicitly adopted social justice framing to gain acceptance in Western societies. They know that Americans who have been trained to view everything through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed will sympathize with anyone who claims oppression. So they present Islam as a persecuted religion. They frame Muslims as victims of Western racism and imperialism. They use progressive language to make demands that actually advance Islamic legal and social norms. And Western Marxists eat it up because they've been programmed to support anything that opposes Western power structures. They support Islamic activism even though Islam represents everything they claim to oppose. Feminists march alongside Islamists who support Sharia law that treats women as property. LGBT activists defend Islamic organizations that promote death for homosexuality. Atheist progressives protect Islam while attacking Christianity. The cognitive dissonance should be overwhelming, but it's not, because the alliance isn't based on consistent principles. It's based on shared tactical goals. Destroy Western civilization now, fight each other later. This alliance is visible in how Western institutions treat Islam versus Christianity. Schools that ban Christmas allow Islamic prayer and holidays. Universities that attack Christianity create Muslim prayer spaces and halal dining options. Media that mock Christian beliefs treat Islam with reverence and refuse to show images of Muhammad or critically examine Islamic doctrine. This isn't principled religious neutrality. This is the Red-Green Alliance in action. Marxists using institutional power to elevate Islam while suppressing Christianity because Christianity is associated with the West and they want to destroy, while Islam is seen as opposed to the West. The alliance is also visible in immigration policy. Western leftists push for massive immigration from Muslim-majority countries while claiming it's about humanitarian compassion. But the practical effect is demographic transformation that weakens Western cultural cohesion and creates populations that will support policies undermining Western values. Marxists think they're importing future voters who will support socialism and oppose capitalism. They're partially right. Muslim populations in the West do tend to vote for left-wing parties that promise more government benefits and oppose Western military intervention in Muslim countries. But what Marxists don't understand is that they're importing an ideology that will eventually demand things they can't accept. When Muslim populations grow large enough to have real political power, they won't be satisfied with socialism. They'll demand Islam. And at that point, the alliance breaks down. Because Marxists aren't willing to go live under Sharia law. They're not willing to give up their atheism, their sexual freedom, their rejection of traditional morality. They thought they were importing allies. They actually imported their future oppressors. We're starting to see glimpses of this conflict in Europe. Left-wing European politicians who supported Muslim immigration are now facing demands for Sharia law, restrictions on free speech about Islam, and the implementation of Islamic social norms. They're discovering that the populations they imported don't share their secular progressive values, but it's too late. The demographic changes have already happened. The Muslim populations are already established and growing. The political dynamics have shifted. European countries are stuck managing conflicts between their progressive values and Islamic demands, with no good solutions available. America is on the same path. The Red-Green Alliance is operating here too. Marxists in academia, media, and government are promoting Islamic immigration and suppressing criticism of Islam. Islamic organizations are using progressive rhetoric to advance their agenda. The demographic and political changes are accelerating, and most Americans have no idea it's happening because the media doesn't cover it honestly, and the schools don't teach the history that would help people recognize the pattern. The alliance between Marxism and Islam is tactical, temporary, and based on shared opposition to Western civilization. But it's incredibly effective at undermining the West because it combines Marxist institutional control with Islamic population growth and political organization. Understanding this alliance is critical to understanding what's happening in America. This isn't just about politics. This isn't just about different policy preferences. This is about two totalitarian ideologies working together to destroy the freest, most prosperous civilization in human history. And they're using Western values, tolerance, compassion, openness to diversity, as weapons against the civilization that created those values. Let's address the fundamental question. Why do leftists in America, living in the most prosperous capitalist nation in history, built on Christian principles, support socialism and align with Islam? The answer is indoctrination, pure and simple. They've been programmed to believe things that are demonstrably false and to support ideologies that are incompatible with their own interests. Let's start with socialism. Every single time socialism has been tried, it's failed. Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Cambodia, East Germany, the list goes on and on. Every attempt at socialist economics has produced poverty, oppression, and mass death. This isn't debatable. It's historical fact. Socialism doesn't work because it's based on flawed assumptions about human nature and economics. Central planning can't match the efficiency of free markets. Collective ownership destroys individual incentive. Confiscatory taxation kills economic growth. But American leftists don't care about this evidence. They've been taught that socialism is compassionate and moral, while capitalism is greedy and exploitive. They've been taught that socialist failures were just implementation problems, not inherent flaws in the system. They've been taught that America needs socialism despite all the evidence that capitalism has produced unprecedented prosperity. This is indoctrination defeating evidence. They believe whatever they've been taught, and no amount of real-world failure changes their minds. The same thing happens with their support for Islam. They've been taught that Islam is a religion of peace, that Muslims are victims of Western aggression, that criticism of Islam is racism. They believe all of this despite all the evidence of Islamic oppression, conquest, slavery, and terrorism. They can't reconcile the contradiction between their progressive values and Islamic practices because they've never been taught to think critically about it. They've just been trained to shut down the moment someone criticizes Islam, labeling it as bigotry without examining whether the criticism is valid. This is the product of decades of educational indoctrination. Starting in elementary school, American kids are taught a version of history that emphasizes Western sins while ignoring or minimizing the sins of other civilizations. They learn about American slavery in exhaustive detail. They learn about European colonialism. They learn about the oppression of indigenous peoples. But they don't learn about the Arab slave trade. They don't learn about Islamic conquest. They don't learn about the failures of non-Western civilizations. This creates a distorted worldview where the West is uniquely evil and all problems can be traced back to Western capitalism, Christianity, and colonialism. Then, in high school and college, this gets reinforced and expanded. Critical theory teaches them to view everything through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. They learn that capitalism is exploitative, that Christianity is oppressive, that Western values are tools of white supremacy. They're never taught the other side. They're never exposed to the arguments for capitalism, for Christianity, for Western civilization. They're never shown the evidence that capitalist countries are more prosperous, that Christian principles enabled individual freedom, that Western values have produced more human flourishing than any alternative. They just get one side. Socialism good, capitalism bad, Islam oppressed, Christianity oppressive, West evil, non-West victims. And this programming is reinforced through media, entertainment, and corporate culture once they leave school. Every institution they interact with pushes the same messages. So they will never encounter serious challenges to what they believe. This explains why they can live in a capitalist Christian nation and still support socialism and Islam. They don't see the contradiction because they've been taught that capitalism causes poverty, despite the evidence of massive prosperity around them. They've been taught that Christianity is oppressive, despite living in a country with more religious freedom than any Islamic nation. The evidence is right in front of them. America's capitalist system has created more wealth and lifted more people out of poverty than any socialist system. America's Christian foundation has produced more individual liberty than any Islamic theocracy. But they can't see it because the programming filters out contradictory evidence. Their brains have been trained to dismiss capitalism's successes as exploitation and to blame capitalism's problems on insufficient socialism. They've been trained to ignore Islam's oppressive practices while attacking Christianity for far less. This is cognitive dissonance being managed through indoctrination. When reality contradicts the programming doesn't change. The person finds ways to explain away the contradiction without questioning their beliefs. There's also a psychological component. Supporting socialism and defending Islam makes leftists feel morally superior. It allows them to signal their enlightenment, their compassion, their progressive values. They get social rewards for these beliefs, approval from their peers, inclusion in the right communities, career advancement in institutions dominated by progressive ideology. The psychological and social incentives all push toward maintaining the programming, not questioning it. And there's a spiritual void that leftists are trying to fill with ideology. When you reject Christianity, when you have no transcendent meaning or purpose, you look for something to fill that hole. For many leftists, socialism becomes a secular religion. It promises salvation through a political action. It provides moral certainty and a sense of purpose. It creates community and shared identity. Supporting Islam serves a similar function. It allows them to feel like they're standing up for the oppressed, fighting against injustice, opposing Western imperialism. It gives them a cause and a sense of meaning. They don't recognize that they're supporting ideologies that would destroy everything they claim to value. They don't see that socialism would eliminate the prosperity they enjoy. They don't understand that Islamic law would eliminate the freedoms they exercise daily. They're like children playing with matches, completely oblivious to the fact that they're about to burn down their own house. And this is why trying to reason with them doesn't work. You can present all the evidence of socialism's failures. You can show them the reality of Islamic oppression. You can point out the contradictions in their beliefs. It doesn't matter, because they're not operating on reason. They're operating on programming that has been reinforced for decades and that provides psychological, social, and spiritual benefits that they're not willing to give up. The only thing that breaks through is reality hitting them personally. When they experience the consequences of the policies they support, when they get victimized by crime in the progressive cities they helped create, when they face discrimination for being white or Christian or conservative in the diverse utopia they promoted, when they lose their jobs to the very systems they supported, that's when some of them wake up. When the programming crashes against reality so hard that they can't ignore it anymore. When the cost of maintaining the delusion becomes higher than the cost of admitting they were wrong. But most never reach that point. They'll go their whole lives supporting ideologies that harm them, believing lies that serve their enemies, and attacking the very civilization that gave them the freedom to be so spectacularly wrong. That's the tragedy of leftist indoctrination. It creates people who are literally working to destroy their own society while thinking that they're making it better. Let me bring this all together so you understand exactly what we're facing. For 1,400 years, Islam practiced slavery on a scale larger and more brutal than anything the West did. They enslaved 17 to 20 million Africans, castrated the men to prevent reproduction. They used women as sexual slaves, and they justified it all through religious texts that have never been repudiated. The history is deliberately suppressed because acknowledging it would undermine the narrative that the West is uniquely evil. It would force people to recognize that slavery was universal and that Islamic slavery was worse than Western slavery in every measurable way. The suppression serves the Red-Green Alliance, Marxists and Islamists working together to destroy Western civilization. Marxists control the narrative through media and education. Islamists use that narrative to advance their agenda of demographic transformation and eventual implementation of Islamic law. And American leftists, living in the most prosperous, capitalist, Christian nation in history, support socialism and defend Islam because they've been indoctrinated to believe lies that serve interests opposed to their own. They don't understand that socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried. They don't understand that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with the liberal values they claim to support. They don't understand that they're useful idiots being used by ideologies that will eventually destroy them. This is what happens when education becomes indoctrination, when media becomes propaganda, when people are taught what to think instead of how to think. The Red-Green Alliance is real. The Islamic agenda in the West is real. The demographic and political transformation is happening right now. And most Americans have no idea because the truth is being systematically suppressed. But you know now. You understand the history they don't teach. You recognize the pattern that's been consistent for 1400 years. You see the alliance that's working to destroy Western civilization. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You can't change most people's minds. The indoctrination is too deep. The social costs of questioning are too high. The psychological benefits of maintaining the program are too strong. But you can speak the truth. You can refuse to go along with the lies. You can help the people who are ready to question. You can build alternatives to the institutions that have been captured. And that's exactly what we're doing at Truth in the Darkness. This brings me to something critical that I want to talk to you about. Something that matters more now than ever before. Silence is no longer neutral. In a culture where truth is filtered, softened, or buried entirely, silence becomes cooperation. Stories go untold because they don't fit the approved narrative. Faith is pushed aside because it challenges power. Honest questions are labeled dangerous. And too many voices choose quiet. Not because they lack conviction, but because the cost of speaking has become real. The Truth in the Darkness network exists to refuse that silence. This platform was built to shine light where it's been intentionally withheld, to confront deception with clarity, to ground truth in faith, and to speak plainly when others won't. Every show, article, and resource is created independently without corporate sponsors, political handlers, or institutional pressure dictating what can and cannot be said. That independence is our strength. It's also what makes your support essential. The episode you just listened to, this wouldn't exist on corporate media. They wouldn't touch the Arab slave trade. They wouldn't call out the leftist indoctrination. They wouldn't expose the Red-Green Alliance. They wouldn't connect Islamic expansion to what's happening in America today. Because they answer to advertisers who have business interests in the Middle East. Because they answer to billionaire owners who don't want to defend Islamic countries. Because they answer to progressive audiences who would call this Islamophobic and demand it be taken down. We don't answer to any of them. We answer to truth. We answer to you. But that independence comes with a cost. We don't have corporate money. We don't have advertising revenue from pharmaceutical companies or defense contractors. We don't have grants from foundations that want to control our message. We have you, the people. That's it. The people who believe that truth still matters, that faith still belongs in the public square, that silence is not an option. That's why I'm asking you to support our Stand Against the Silence campaign. Donating to Stand Against the Silence isn't about finding a brand. It's about sustaining a mission. It keeps investigative stories alive. It protects honest commentary. It allows faith-driven content to exist without compromise. And it ensures that truth doesn't disappear simply because it's inconvenient. Your support says truth still matters. Faith still belongs in the public square. Silence is not an option. When you donate to this campaign, you're making it possible for us to keep producing content that no one else will touch. Episodes like this one that expose the history that they don't teach. Episodes about the DUI law that's destroying innocent lives. Episodes about the tax shell game Republicans are running in Tennessee. Episodes about media consolidation and leftist indoctrination and the spiritual battle for Western civilization. You're funding the truth in a world that's built on lies. You're supporting voices that refuse to be silenced. You're standing against the darkness that wants to consume our civilization. If you believe light should be defended, if you believe voices should remain unfiltered, if you believe truth should never have to ask permission, this is where you stand. Visit TITDUSA.com and look for the Stand Against the Silence campaign. Donate whatever you can, $5, $20, $50, whatever you're able to contribute makes a difference because it allows us to keep speaking truth without fear. Thank you for standing against the silence. Thank you for supporting independent media that refuses to bow to corporate interests or progressive ideology. Thank you for believing that the truth is worth defending. The Arab slave trade lasted 1,400 years because people stayed silent. Because nobody wanted to challenge the religious and political powers that justified it. Because speaking truth was dangerous. We're not staying silent. We're speaking the truth they don't want you to hear. We're exposing the lies they've built their power on. We're shining light into the darkness that they want to keep hidden. Stand with us. Support the mission. Refuse the silence. The darkness hates the light, but the light always wins when people are brave enough to defend it. I'll see you next week.